In the name of the one and only, we are beginning the next session of our discussion on solstice. And here we are talking about, I think in the previous session, we made reference to religions such as Zarwanism, traditions such as those of the Egyptians, the namings of the days of the week, and how that permeated through Eastern and Western cultures. We talked about how the cultural perceptions of acceptability were often seen either as inferior or superior to others, and the pejoratives that were developed, such as those of the Greeks and the barbarians, and many more. We moved on to the area where I give you a preliminary on how the religion that was known then as Mitraism came into Europe, primarily bypassing the Greek lands and then surrounding them from the west. What is relevant to our discussion here is that in Mitraism, just in other sun-worshipping myths and traditions and religion, the calendars were based on, of course, the movement of the sun, not only in its 24-hour cycle, but when the earth rotates around the sun, or as they perceived it, the sun rotated around the earth, but also in its seasonal cycle, moving from the equator north and south, and therefore creating these seasonal shifts, which would then result in two equinoxes, around March 21st, and the other one around October 21st, or September 21st rather, and then the two solstices, the summer solstice of June 21st, approximate dates of course, as well as those of December 21st. So in that sense then, we had the significance of the sun, both as they understood it scientifically to the best of their ability, as well as to the way it was then culturally sent down to the level of the masses, where the birth of the sun was a significant thing, and what they perceived, at least perhaps in the popular cultural level, was that the sun was going away from them. And again, we are talking about the people of the northern hemisphere, and it got to a point where they had to make sacrifices, they had to make rituals, they had to do things to make the sun come back, to make it come back north. And the solstice point, if we can call it that, around December 21st, would be that point where the sun makes that journey back to the northern hemisphere. And so that will be the beginning of the coming back of the sun, and therefore it would signify the solstice in the sense of the rebirth of the sun. it's only a matter of coincidence that we celebrate Christmas, the birth of the Son, S-O-N, in the Christian perception of Jesus. But then that is probably not so much a coincidence, but a kind of a compromise in the historical sense. So let me go to the Mitraistic concept of that, which was, again, probably not too different from that of the Sumerians and the Babylonians. The division of time in terms of seasons and in terms of the 365 days, and in terms of the rites and rituals that they had created for these, and that would have been shared by many of the cultures of the East, as societies were primarily agrarian, and agriculture was important in people's life. And so then we move to the birth of the Son, that when Europeans in pre-Christian Europe celebrated the birth of the Son, the S-U-N, then there were festivities and activities that were organized around that period of time. The Romans had two major celebrations. One was called Compitalia, which was celebrated around late December or early January. And then they had another celebration or another festivity, which was called Lupercalia, which was celebrated around February 15th. And again, I'm using modern calendar days that may or may not have been the same then. Obviously, they weren't. So first, the Compitalia, which was the late December, early January festivity in ancient Rome. Those were the dates were fixed by various presiding authorities, but from time to time they changed them as they felt comfortable with it. And I think later it was fixed around January 3rd, somewhere between January 3rd and 5th. The Lupercalia festival or tradition or holiday of the Romans had to do with the idea of the lupe. And lupe is wolf, and in the Roman mythology there is a god, Lupercus, who's identified with the god of Faunus, again another Roman deity, which would be the equivalent of the Greek god Pan, although Pan is more like in the shape of a goat, and the Lupercus, the idea is that, the symbol is that of a wolf. And I think in the flag of modern day Rome, the flag of the city of Rome, there is a wolf, and the significance of wolf was that it was an animal that had to be feared, with or without assigning divine attributes to it, and that the people of Rome, especially in winter, were fearful of wolves coming down from from the Alps, from the mountains, and taking away their sheep and goats and their animals. And so the one of the ideas was to prevent this or to reduce the effect of these wolf hunting their animals, or their wolf attacks on their animals, the cattle, was to have a festival as a sacrifice, so that this calamity, this disaster, would not befall on them that year, or its severity would not be as much. And so in that sense, the priests who were celebrating would be wearing goat skins, which again then it takes it back to how that was similar to the Greek god Pan, and how they perceived it there. So that was the Lupercalia festival, which was the second one, and as I said, the first one being the Compitalia. Now, when Christianity came to Europe, Christians were persecuted for nearly 3 centuries in Europe. This was a foreign religion, a Middle Eastern religion, something that they perhaps did not feel comfortable with, a religion that advocated one single God instead of the many that the Greeks and the Romans were used to. So in all these things, until it was time for Emperor Justin of, was it Constantine, who converted to Christianity, and then Christianity gained some notoriety and became acceptable, and so then with the endorsement by the imperial or royal families, therefore Christian religion and rituals and rites became part of people's life. One thing they had trouble with was that people were often used to the earlier traditions they already had. And because of that, replacing them or making them illegal or prohibiting people from having these winter festivities was kind of difficult. So at some point they felt it was necessary to continue to allow the celebration of those holidays, perhaps primarily the Compitalia holiday, to be allowed, but instead of doing the religious rituals of the earlier religions that may have been related to Mithraism, they replaced the concept, that concept, with the birth of Jesus, since now Christianity was accepted and became the approved religion, so to say. And so therefore the birth of Jesus that may have occurred in historical, in terms of historical reality, around June 6th, was instead celebrated at the time of the Compitalia celebration of the ancient Greeks. And so this is a kind of a grafting of the rites and rituals or concepts of one religion, and grafting them onto another one. And so as a result, the belief was created and eventually strengthened in the minds of the many that this was the celebration of the birth of Jesus, that Jesus was born around December 21st or December 25th. The change in the exact date, for that there are 2 reasons. Again, one or 2 explanations. Whether they make sense or not would be up to your judgment. One is that when they would be making the sacrifices around the solstice, the day of solstice, which was around December 21st, they had to wait for the signs of the sun after they made the sacrifices, and then in 2, 3, 4, or 5 days when they saw the sun coming up, they felt that their prayers had been heard and that the sun is coming back, and then it was time to do the celebration, which is December 25th, or the supposed birthday of Jesus. The other argument is that when the Europeans used the ancient calendar, the Julian calendar, a calendar which in some versions had only 10 months instead of 12, and then the Muslims came up with the Jalali calendar that was designed by, among other great astronomers, by Omar Khayyam, that this new Islamic calendar was much more accurate, and that was in the year, I think, close to 7. I'm not sure about the exact date, but I think 975 or thereabouts. So when that calendar came into existence, then I'm trying to see if I can go through my notes to find the exact date. So then the accuracy of the Jalali calendar for the Muslim world, which is in existence to this day, resulted in the Christian West to kind of revise theirs. In other words, theirs was not really as accurate. There were certain days that had to be added and subtracted by order of the Pope, and then the Pope and the person in charge had to go and make a call, and the word for call was kalende, and from the kalende we get the word calendar, and therefore it was the Pope's call, so to say, that a certain day may or may not have existed. And so eventually when they switched, when Pope Gregory ordered the revision or the correction or the adoption of a newer, more accurate calendar, I think it was around the 1500s, then the result was that this new calendar had to be now, it had to replace the old calendar. And it's in this new calendar, the Gregorian calendar, which we use in the West today, and around the world it's known as the calendar of the Common Era. At least in the academic circles, that's how it is named, but still many refer to it as the Christian calendar. I prefer the calendar of the Common Era because, like I said, it has nothing to do with the birth of Jesus, and it has nothing necessarily to do anymore with the Christian world, but rather it's accepted more as globally. So the common calendar, and so as this switching from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar may have resulted in that shifting of the date of Christmas from December 21st to December 25th for many of the Western Roman Catholic-based religious cultural area or region. But some of the Eastern Orthodox still use that old tradition, and they are celebrating Christmas around January 6th and 7th as the day of the birth of Jesus. And as I said, it had nothing to do with either one. Now, how is that related to solstice, and how are these traditions then changing? So now, if the Mitraistic concept has been, so to say, Christianized to switch the concept of the birth of the sun, S-U-N, to the birth of the sun as S-O-N, then we could also look at some of the other traditions that we have, which again has this cultural cross-pollination or cross-cultural pollination. That of the Christmas tree, for instance. As a disclaimer, I personally am as much against the tradition of the Christmas tree as I'm against the sacrifice tradition of sacrifice during Hajj by Muslims, because both of them are inconsiderate of the environmental damage that they cause. That's my personal opinion. I'll keep that to myself, but I had to mention it nonetheless. But the concept of the Christmas tree, and again, as I said, I'm against it because of the deliberate deforestation of vast areas, which is sad. It occurred merely as a matter of coincidence. That if I remember this date correctly, at the year 452 or thereabouts, when Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, took over Babylon, the city surrendered, and Cyrus entered the city victoriously. And in a few days' time, he was awoken, or his attention was drawn to the fact that the news came to him that there was a rebellion. And the rebellion was understood that there were hundreds or perhaps thousands of people marching to the palace where Cyrus resided, and these people had sticks in their hand, and so the guards, the Persian guards, would have been fearful of this rebellion, thinking that the Babylonians had come with the intent of rebelling against Cyrus the Great. And they informed the king, and the king said, being surprised as to what happened. They surrendered the city, and the war is over. So why this arming and marching towards the palace? Well, when the dust cleared and the communications took place, Cyrus was told that no, this was not a rebellion, but that the people had come because that was the day of their new year, which would have been around the vernal equinox, around March 21st, and that it was their tradition to plant a tree on the first day of the new year, to add to protect the environment and to have more trees and gardens and all that. And the Fertile Crescent is of course known for having these lush green gardens, and their cities are built around the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates, and water is part of their life, and all that. So the significance of it was there, but we could also add the fact that the word Baghdad is actually the word Baghdad, the garden of justice, and so greenery, gardens, the environment, that was in a sense their forte, so to say. And so they had come to the new conqueror, to the new king, to do the honoring, to do the honor of planting the first tree, or to help them plant their trees. And so when Cyrus figured out that this was no rebellion, he participated in this ritual of the Babylonians and planted that tree on the first day of their new year. Cyrus comes back to Persia later on and brings this tradition with him, and along with it certain other traditions that are often part of the new year. And as I said earlier, that in the course of time, when this concept of planting a tree on the new year becomes part of the rites and rituals, then it permeates and eventually finds its way to Europe. The problem in Europe was that we are now talking about different climate, that the Babylonian New Year was around the spring equinox, and if the Europeans had chosen to start their new year in the winter solstice, then their new year is sort of off season as far as planting goes. Nevertheless, they keep the tradition, and they were supposed to be planting a tree on the new year that starts with the birth of Jesus, around at the end of December, beginning of January, and all that, which is a whole other discussion. And so the tradition of Christmas tree was sort of institutionalized. The problem with that is that due to environmental changes and seasonal changes, that is not the time of the year to plant a tree and expect it to grow, at least in my estimation. But instead then they decided to have a tree, to plant it, or at least to erect a tree in their living room and to decorate it, and the rest, as they say, is history. And so therefore the tradition of the Christmas tree also comes from the east, way back from the east, from Babylon by way of Persia to Europe and all that. So now we have discussed this link of how the winter solstice, the Christmas tree, and the birth of Jesus are in a way myths in both sense of the word. Myth in the sense that they are not true, in the sense that this is not really the birth of the celebration of the birthday of Jesus, who was born in June instead of December. And myth in the sense that it has become a tradition, that people have accepted it. However, as I shared my reservations with you, I hope that people either do not plant Christmas, do not have Christmas trees, but if they have them, they should plant them, or if they can, maybe they should resort to artificial ones so that deforestation could be reduced, if not eliminated altogether. And now we go to a different direction in that, and the direction we take is the concept of Yalda, which is which is the winter solstice. It's the celebration of the longest night of the year. It is the celebration in the sense that Yalda, which is which is an Assyrian term, and Assyrian being related to the Semitic languages, then Yalda also is connoting a birth day from Milad or from Mawlud, which we coincidentally this year we had the Milad last week, the birth of Prophet Muhammad, and now we have the birth of the sun, the sun, the solar birth, and next week we are going to have the birth of the sun, son, if I didn't transpose one on the other, which will be a Christian tradition. So a Muslim tradition, a Christian tradition, and a Mitraistic Zoroastrian tradition, they all come together in this season. And yes, we have Hanukkah and Kwanzaa and several other traditions also being celebrated. So in a sense it is a holiday season. But to go back to the concept of the Yalda, the longest night, there the idea is again that in the early agrarian societies, season, the change of season was significant, and that all their traditions were such that God was seen close to nature. And perhaps that was one of the reasons that when there were natural disasters, floods and typhoons and windstorms and all that, they were considered as an action that represented the wrath and anger of gods, because God was so close to nature. And yes, we could also add the term from an Islamic perspective, that the word ayah, a sign, which is used for a verse in the Quran, is also a word that is used for a sign in nature as an evidence or a manifestation of God's creation, or the creation of the beauty of God. So in that sense we have two Qurans. One is in the pages of a book that is filled with ayahs as verses. The other one would be in the pages of nature, in the trees and in the leaves and in the whole environment, in the rose petals. And there are also pages that are turning, that in a way is an evidence of their creator, God, that this would be a manifestation of that. And so the earlier agrarian societies had all their festivities scheduled around these critical points in their calendar. And so we have the tradition in Southwest Asia, Afghanistan, modern-day Iran, and Tajikistan and other areas, the celebration of Nowruz, or the first day of the new year, which is the spring equinox. And then from the spring equinox we move on to the summer solstice around June 21st, and then from that we move to the next shifting or switching of the season around September 21st, which will be the Mehragan festivities. And from that we move to Yalda, which is the winter solstice. And so therefore all these four festivities, I didn't elaborate much on the summer solstice because I do not have the material with me, but I'm sure they had things around that date too. So these would be celebrations of the season. Now, going back to the initial concept of chronos, time, under the Zarwani concept of time being primal and divine as well, I think these are all then connected. But in Yelda, we are celebrating in the sense that light comes from darkness, just as symbolically from the Islamic tradition, the Prophet had to go to the dark cave of Hira. It is in that dark cave that he received the first revelation of the Quran. But before he receives the revelation, he had made that his tradition of staying in the dark. Now, this would be the exact opposite of what our linguistic terminology today indicates. When we say someone is in the dark, we are speaking primarily as someone not having the awareness or understanding of a certain concept, phenomenon, news, or whatever. Whereas in the sense of being in the dark, in the way the Prophet experiences that he had to leave the realm of the worldly, where there was supposedly light for the sight, for the outer eyes, but there wasn't light for the vision, for the inner eye. So he had to close his outer eyes on the outer reality of the world out there. That would have been the environs of Mecca, his hometown. And every year he went on a retreat into this cave, some 3 miles north of Mecca, or away from Mecca, if my sense of direction is correct. That he would stay in this day, in this cave for some 40 days, so that he could contemplate on the greater reality, so that the physical reality of the environs of Mecca would not stand in the way. And by that, I might be getting a little poetic here. The sense is that sometimes the reality that you see is hiding the reality that the visible reality hides behind. That the visible reality becomes a veil in itself, and the truth is hidden behind it and beyond it. And so therefore the Prophet would make sure that this visible reality does not blind him to the truth of the invisible, which is beyond it. And so he would retreat to the darkness of this cave. And that's where he could see the world without that vision being blocked by seeing Mecca, and that the world was greater than Mecca. And so therefore in a lot of cases you have to go to the depth of darkness to give yourself an opportunity to open the inner eye, so you can see more through your sense of vision than through your sense of sight. Now, in the celebration of the tradition of Yelda, the solstice or the longest night, we can do the same. That yes, it's the longest night, the darkness is maximized, and when you go into it, you can come out of it with the birth of the sun. And this sun could be the celestial body of our solar system, but that sun could also be a light from within you. a sense of awareness and a sense of awakening. And in terms of the circumstance that prevail in our time and in our times, and I'm talking about the current time of December 2016 of the Common Era, is that there is way too much darkness. And that darkness is not because the sun is not shining out there. That darkness is because we have closed up on the light that should have enlightened us. Look at the tragedies around the world. The tragedy that Aleppo falls, not because of which party wins and which party loses, but because the people of Aleppo are massacred, basically. They are driven away. They are killed by the thousands. They are being bombed. They are being destroyed. Now, if we did not know about this, we would have probably felt better, at least relieved. But the fact is, for a tragedy like this to be happening in times like these, in the presence of all sorts of media, including the social media, when people are seeing the horrendous calamity befalling on the people who, out of no fault of their own, happen to be residing in one of the oldest continuously lived cities in the world, and are now being driven out because of the politics of one side or the other. And an even greater tragedy is that the one side or the other are none of their own. These are foreign powers, foreign dictators, foreign presidents, foreign rulers, whose own foreign interest dictate that the situation ought to turn one way or another. And the hell, and perhaps literally the hell, with what happens to the people who live there. That is the darkness we live in, because we have become so numb, we have become so indifferent that it no longer registers. It doesn't stir us. It doesn't wake us up. It doesn't wake us up into thinking, and it certainly does not wake us up into acting. And yes, if human life is worth saving, then we should not match tragedy with another tragedy. There are many occurring. We had one in the Berlin market, Christmas marketplace. That should not have happened as much as the one in Aleppo should not have happened. Yes, tragedies that occur in Europe, on the European soil, or in America, they get more exposure because the media is here. But tragedies that happen in faraway places, and by far away I do not necessarily mean geographic distances, but distances that are distanced through our cultural relativism, through our prejudices, where we have created otherness out of human beings. We have created otherness out of our own kind. And so we turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to their better reality. And by turning our blind eyes, we reinforce the darkness within which we exist. Yes, we can celebrate the solstice. We can celebrate Yalda. We can celebrate the longest night with all its darkness. But unless we wake up from this darkness, we will remain in there for a long time. For a long, long time. So if there's going to be any meaningful celebration of Yalda, and for that matter, if there's going to be any meaningful celebration of Christmas at the end of the week, just remember, Jesus was from a place pretty close to Aleppo. And European Christianity, also correctly labeled as Paulian Christianity or Hellenic Christianity, was brought when Paul saw the light on the way to Damascus. And Damascus is burning too. All of Syria is burning. A country where the majority of its population has been displaced, internal refugees as well as external refugees. That is the darkness in which we live. That's the darkness in which we operate. So I apologize for not posting my traditional annual Yalda night celebration postings on social media that I usually do. But my bewilderment, my hesitance was due to the fact that I'm not sure if we are celebrating it correctly. Through the numbness and this insensitivity that we manifest as humans, as civilized human beings. I think a whole lot of those attributes in reference to us ought to be called into question as to whether we truly deserve having them. Are we civilized? I apologize for taking this on a different turn, but yes, celebrate the night of Yalda. Some question it as though this is a kind of a quote-unquote a pagan tradition. There's no such a thing. It's a common tradition of our common human culture. Wherever it may have started, there's nothing wrong with it. By celebrating Yalda, you are still, in a way, celebrating the glory of God, who has created an environment for us where through the many shifts and seasons we can make commitments ourselves as to what we stand for, what do we amount to, and what do we really represent. The human soul is a beautiful gift that God has given to us. Are we honoring it? Are we living it? Or are we simply shackled to the cage of this body that weighs way too heavy upon us and weighs too heavy upon our souls? and we can't just liberate ourselves. Free spirit should not be just a word, an expression, a terminology. A spirit ought to be free. Is yours. I hope it's mine. Within my limitations, I try to at least make the point that our global reach ought to be such that our spirit must be free to feel the senses and sensibilities of all people around the world. No other criteria of religious distinction, cultural differences, tribalisms and nationisms and other isms that create walls among us and between us, that separates us into the friend and the foe and the foreign, into the I and the you and the other. That should not be the criteria, but the criteria should be that we are all brothers and sisters in humanity. What you believe is your business. I'm not responsible for it. And therefore, where I do not have responsibility, I should equally do not have the jurisdiction of making judgment, especially when that judgment emanates from a sense of my own superiority of the self and then inferiority of the other, but rather that we are lost souls floating on this earth, in this environment, and we ought to honor that we ought to soar above it, rise above it, and become one with everyone, so we can reach the one and only, the one and only. Have a nice day.